Well, time went by, and we got the horse outside, and, oh yes. Uh, Grandpa put the saddle on and the bridle, and it was still pretty cold, so they got me all dressed up in my mittens and my bonnet, put me up in the saddle. Oh, I don't think I was there probably a minute. Kicked me right off. Okay, a few weeks later, we did the same thing. And then the same, and then the same, and finally, in the spring.
She was never able to ride the horse.
No, I couldn't.
Never ride the horse. He'd always buck her off.
Even, I had a kid that went to school with me, and he was a great big long-legged kid, and he says, "You let me get on that horse, I'll break him."
See, there's one thing you should mention. He was not a full-grown horse. He was a Shetland pony.
I mentioned that.
Oh, you did? I didn't think you did. Okay.
Anyhow, to make this long story short, the boy said, "Okay, my dad, let's take him out to the farm. He'll break him." He couldn't even. Rex went back to the stockyards. Grandpa just couldn't stand it. I had to have some kind of a
pet
animal. So he brought me home a goat. And that goat was so cute. Billy was his name, naturally. Had some horns. And he just was another dog. He'd follow me around, and he was a real pet. Mother would send me to the store, which was just across the street practically. I would go, behind me was Patsy, behind Patsy the cat, behind the cat the goat, all in a line. Mrs. Jeff, who ran the store, would let me in, the dog in, the cat in, but slammed the door on the goat, poor goat. Well, Billy was a member of the family until he decided one day when Mother done the washing out. I think I'll eat some of that stuff. Mother said couldn't have that. So Billy went back to the stockyards.
And I found out that in stockyards they use goats to herd sheep.
To lead sheep.
To lead sheep. Well, okay. Anyway, they seem to goats seem to take over, and they will tend sheep. Is that right? They sort of tend to. Well, anyway, he went back to the stockyards.
Yeah. So I just had my cat and dog then.
Well, how long was that you had that goat? You remember?
Oh, gosh.
6 months or a week or?
No, probably a year.
I see.
One thing he used to do, we finally chained him because he was going to follow me all the time. So we chained him a great big long chain, staked here and the chain way out there. Well, he'd get at one end of the chain and he'd go like a bat out of a hot place, clear to the other end. Well, that was kind of fun, so he'd do that and do that. One time he fell and lit on a horn, and
would he pull and snap the chain?
Trying to.
Oh, trying to snap the chain. I see.
So anyhow, I don't know. That's probably just about enough of my.
Oh yeah, tell about moving the bank and when the bank moved from Washington to Blair.
Yes.
Well,
we moved to Kennard.
Let me tell the story about moving to Blair. The Kennard State Bank was the same charter that had been in Washington. What was the name of the fellow that started the bank? Jabe
in Washington? Jabe Gibson.
Jabe Gibson. He was an Omaha person who's...
Norfolk.
Oh, he wasn't in Omaha?
Norfolk.
Oh, he lived in Norfolk. I never knew that. Okay, I'm getting a little history here. Anyway, he was the one that took out the charter, and it was the Washington State Bank. And George Headland, Jeanette's father, ran it. Eventually, of course, Washington was a town of 50 to 75 population, and they were looking for something better, and they moved, and I don't know when this was. It was after Jeanette was born, so it had to be, say, 25 or 26. How old were you when you went to Kennard? Do you remember? What grade did you start in?
I was probably...
you went through the first...
7, 8 years old, somewhere in there.
Okay, so that had to be in 28 or 27. And they changed the name of the bank to the Kennard State Bank, but it was still the original charter. And George, again, ran the bank. Well, now, the Depression came along, or started, back east in October 1929 with the great stock market crash. And things in Nebraska, after all, New York City was a whole half a continent away. And it took a long time for that depression to get out here, and it was in 1931 that the Farmer State Bank in Blair went broke and closed. Now, there had been a previous bank, another bank called the Citizen State Bank, and it had closed prior to the Farmer State. So here was Blair, a town of, by that time it was about 3,000, with no bank. And there was a group of people, businessmen, went over to Kennard and talked to George about moving the bank to Blair. Well, of course, George had to talk to, was it still Jabe Gibson?
I guess so.
Okay, we'll say it was Jabe Gibson. And they had to get permission from the state banking department. But anyway, the Kennard State Bank was approached by the businessmen in Blair, or a group of businessmen, to move to Blair, because after all, Blair was a town of 3,000 population and no place to get change, no place to deposit your money, no place to, after all, every businessman needs coins or needs to make deposits, and they had to go to Kennard to do that. So it was in, what year was it, 1930 what, about 33?
I guess.
It was about 1933 that the Kennard State Bank moved to Blair and became the Washington County Bank, but it was still the same charter. So here we are, we have George and Jeanette and Vera living in Kennard, and George is running the Washington County Bank in Blair. And now tell them about moving the house.
Okay. I would like to clear up, though, it wasn't Jay Gibson in Kennard. By that time, we were affiliated with First National in Omaha, because Mother used to take money in. But anyhow.
Now, wait a minute. Grandma used to take money from the bank to Omaha? She was the Wells Fargo?
She was the Wells Fargo.
Well, how did they do that?
Well,
She just stuck it in the
don't
Put
bank?
the money in the bag
you
and
remember?
nobody knew it.
I showed you a little black bag it's up in the storeroom in Hard Rapids.
Yeah.
And it's, this long, this wide, and you get a lot of money in it. Looks like a doctor's bag is what it looks like. And Daddy would put a lot of cash and whatnot in there, and he would call First National Bank and say, Vera is on her way. That's all. He didn't say with what, and they would have a cop or something standing there waiting for him, and she drove up. Heavens. And that sounds like something she'd do.
Wow.
Well, you want to realize that we lived in a different time.
Different era. I know.
Yeah.
It's a different era.
Yeah.
And Kennard was a little bank, and I don't think Jesse James was going to go to Kennard to rob the bank. He certainly picked something better than the bank at Kennard. No offense, dear, but Kennard was a small town.
Well, anyway, go ahead and tell about moving the house.
Oh, well, of course, when we decided that we should move to Blair, we began to look for houses. Well, the new banker's coming to town. Oh, well, of course, the price went up on anything that we looked at. So Daddy talked to somebody from Fremont, I believe it was, that did house moving. He came to the house in Kennard, looked it over. Sure, do that. Now, mind you, it had radiators, steam plant. Well, of course, then we begin to wonder what's going to happen with those radiators. Oh, they'll be all right. So we lived in the bank building in Kennard while the house was being transported to Blair. and we watched it go out of town. I had the measles then, the only childhood disease I ever had. Anyhow, they got it out of town. This was the early fall. They got it across the bridge there. They were going, what's the number of that road that goes, that gravel road
It goes to
that hits
Omaha?
31?
No, I don't know what it is, but
I don't know, it's a gravel road. They
she's
had,
talking about, there's a gravel road from Kennard that goes over to 133 now.
Oh, it's blacktop now. It was called the Kennard Cutoff.
Yeah,
but I
okay.
oh,
don't-
it's blacktop?
It's
Yeah,
blacktop
Forevermore.
now.
Well, anyhow, we could not take it on Highway 30. They didn't want to have a great big house.
Well, I think there was a bridge west of town there, or east of town, that it wouldn't go through.
Could be. Anyhow, they got it in this field, just outside of Kennard. And we had a terrible snowstorm, and it sat there all winter.
Oh, my word.
So, in the very early spring, they pulled it up over these little hills, and things went pretty well until they got on 131, and something happened. The house kind of shifted, and 2 or 3 of these heavy radiators fell over, and it tipped the house, and it sat up against a bank for a week till they could get that righted. So we got down to Highway 30. Okay? You cannot bring this house in unless you start after midnight. No, you can't block the traffic. So, okay. Let's see, was I driving? I think I was driving then. Anyhow, we had got friends lined up, and we put those cars there and turned the lights on. Okay, we get into town. We pull up on South Street. You cannot bring that house down here unless you plank it. Okay, so, and of course, I don't know who it was told the movers that, but, all right, we'll get some heavy planks and plank it. Well, I don't know how many planks were splintered trying to get that house moved. Finally, they said, oh, go ahead, it's only 2 or 3 blocks. We got it
The
set
house
on the
weighed
foundation.
so much that those metal wheel trucks splintered the planks.
Good heavens.
Well, you know, a house like that weighs something like 80 to 100 tons. And it was on 3 trucks. As a kid, this was quite an operation, and I remember I stood right there and watched it go down South Street. And there was 3 trucks, 2 in back and 1 in the front that they guided it with. And they pulled it down South Street, and the foundation had been all prepared, and the house was pulled off. And I watched, as a kid, I watched them move that house over the foundation. They built cribbing. They took railroad ties, and they put 2 of them this way, and 2 this way, and 2 this way, and built up this crib in the center of the
The foundation.
in the center of the basement. You see, the basement
yeah.
had been dug. There was a basement in the house, and that house was pulled out over the foundation on very heavier planks with cribbing underneath it. And it was quite a job.
And then how did they get it down on the foundation?
Well, it was up on, eventually they transferred the load to jacks. In other words, they got under with jacks and raised it up, and this enabled them to take the trucks out and take the cribbing out. It's sitting on jacks, but the house is all properly positioned right over the foundation, and then these screw jacks are gradually lowered, and the house comes right down and sits on the foundation. And that's the way it's done.
Same way they do it today.
Hmm?
That's the same way they do it today.
That's the way they do it today, and I think Jeanette probably has forgotten it, but I watched them move that house down South Street and over the foundation. And of course, being a mechanical kid, I was interested in things like that.
Were you there when they set the house on the foundation? Were you there?
Yeah.
I didn't know him.
But we didn't know
You
each
didn't
other.
know each
Yeah.
other.
No, we didn't know each other.
If you remember your tape.
Yes.
Henry, no. Well, where am I?
Well, you've just moved to Blair.
Just moved to Blair. Well, started the school, had lots of friends, a bunch of us girls with, just what every kid does.
What was Blair like then?
Oh.
What's your first recollection?
First recollection? Oh, it was a big town. Coming from Kennard.
Did you look forward to this move?
Yes and no. I hated to leave my friends in Kennard. I had a lot of friends. Virginia was one of them.
Yeah.
No, but it didn't take long to adjust because people were friendly and I had a lot of fun.
How many houses were on the street where you moved your house to?
All of them.
Yours was the
All
last
of
one?
them.
and then-
And
Well-
all the houses that are on that street were there when that house was moved in. Now, I'm thinking of all the houses that were across the street, they were all there.
Yeah.
That was one of the last empty lots on South Street.
And the house across, the Schmidt house was there?
Oh,
And
yeah.
your Hanlon house?
Yes.
Gutshaw's.
Who were some of your neighbors then?
Well, across the street was Phil and Losine O'Hanlon. Walter and Verna Gutshaw. Carl and Iola Schmidt.
The Wolves lived on the corner.
Yes, there was
It
a
was
wolf.
not Wolf's when we first moved in.
Oh,
I'm
it
trying
wasn't.
to think who it was.
Uh,
It's left me. I
And
don't
then
know.
to the east of them, Bruce's lived there, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Bruce's?
well, there was one house. Yeah, they were one
Or was
house.
that the second?
Who was right next door? Was it Simpson?
Simpson.
Simpsons.
Harvey Simpson's
Harvey
parents.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sharon's, okay.
They
Yeah.
he had a garden, old Mr. Simpson. And that, I had Blondie by that time.
Blondie is a dog.
Blondie's a dog. She knows who Blondie was.
Well, but the
Oh,
people
other
here
people.
don't know who
That's
Blondie
right.
is.
Okay. Anyhow,
Blondie was a Cocker Spaniel.
a blonde Cocker Spaniel. Saved your life twice.
Yes.
Anyhow, Blondie would go out and look around the backyard. Of course, nobody ever tied their dogs up then. And she'd go over to Mr. Simpson's garden, pulled up the onions and brought them home and ate them.
She would dig up onions and drag them home and lay
Yeah,
there in the yard and eat those
I
onions.
Yeah.
bet she was popular with a lot of people.
Boy. Oh,
What was Main Street like when you moved there?
well, of course, there was, oh,
Very much the same as it is
Yeah.
today. Well, you stop and think, Mick.
Brick streets?
There hasn't been
Yeah.
any new buildings built on Main Street there. They're still the same ones.
Was there any particular store that caught your mind coming to Blair at that time, in a young girl's mind?
no, not really. No. In fact, about the only thing I remember is the bank, because I used to go up there and work. After school,
And where was the bank then?
it was where the insurance company is
Hanson?
now.
Hanson
Yeah,
Agency.
Hanson's Insurance, yeah. And I think is the clock still there?
Mm-hmm.
The old clock?
Won't run, but it's still there. Your father was quite a booster of 4-H
Oh, yes,
with the bank. When did that start?
yes, definitely. About the time we moved to Blair, which would have been early 30s. Yeah, very much. He was pretty much a public man, so to speak. He was a...
George was a public-spirited individual. He really was.
Omaha,
Well, he belonged to Exarban.
Exarban, that's what I was trying to think. He was one of the members of Exarban. He was just an out-and-out right good guy.
And he had a radio program, didn't he, for a while?
Yes, he did.
Why do you say it like that?
Well, now, he didn't have a radio
Well,
program
he
as
had
such.
a-
He had a 5-minute on KFGT in Fremont. He
Right.
had a 5-minute segment that was done on tape, and he would come to our house at 1762 Colfax, and I had a recorder, and I would record this 5-minute, and it was a commentary on business conditions and farm conditions and hail insurance and all the sorts of things that farmers would be interested in. And he used to come there and record it, and I would mail it, and they would run it several times during the week, and then we'd make another one and we'd send that over. This was not a big deal that George was on the radio, but he did have a radio program that ran on KFGT for farmers.
Once in a while, he got a little carried away with his English too. That's why I was
Oh, he did?
Yes. Mother gets so mad at him. Oh.
Well, didn't he have the Blair News or sponsor the Blair News or something, a 15-minute segment later on?
I don't remember that, Nick.
Well, I don't think so. I
He may have, I don't
know
Seems to
about
me
that.
I've heard his voice on that radio a lot in that segment. Maybe he advertised.
I couldn't.
Well, he used to run his own ads,
Maybe that was it.
if you're thinking.
That maybe is
In other
what-
words,
yeah.
they were always included in this little 5-minute segment. They were included in the tape.
Well, I remember the Blair News, and I remember his voice.
Yeah,
My first recollection of him was through 4-H over at the fair, in County Fair, and
Yeah.
making the presentations at the banquet.
Yeah, he used to do that. I remember that, yeah.
yeah. As I say, he was a great guy.
Well, you spent some time in Denver with your grandparents as a child, and in Minnesota. Relate those to us.
Well, Grandma and Grandpa McCracken moved to Denver to see if it would help her arthritis. It didn't, but nevertheless they were there. They drove out, of course Mother helped them move. And when they got to Denver, Grandpa had driven his car out, and I don't believe he was there a year, maybe 6 months. He said, I'm selling my car. I'm not going to drive in this, because he was up in years then. He would take me to, can't remember what park it was, close to where they lived.
Oh, yeah, it was the Denver Zoo that...
No, this is where they had the races, horse races,
Oh.
the buggies.
Okay, the trying races.
Trying, yeah. I can't remember. Anyhow, he thought that was great, and he'd kind of see to it that I saw horses. It's too bad you couldn't have known him, Gail.
Well, I did.
Yeah, you do remember
Yeah, I
him, I
remember,
guess.
yeah.
Quite a guy, a little Irishman. In Minnesota, of course, Grandma and Grandpa would come up there and be there in the summer. You probably remember that, don't you?
But you used to go to Park Rapids when you were a little girl.
Oh, when I
8
was
years old.
little, oh yes, of course. Yeah, we'd go up there, and one time we were fishing up right close to the Canadian border. Daddy had had eye surgery, and of course the three of us were in the boat. No wonder I don't like fish. Anyhow, I cast out. Only something happened and it got caught on my dad. And I just thought, oh my God, I blinded him.
Where did it catch him in the eye?
Not in the eye, I caught him kind of up in here. Oh. And we, of course, always went someplace around Park Rapids. Usually, well, we went to Eagle Lake and also Potato. Never dreaming one day we'd all be there.
Now, where did you go at Eagle Lake? What, is there anything still
Eagle Bay
there?
Lodge,
Eagle Bay Lodge.
it
okay.
was there then.
It was there then. And on Potato Lake, you went where?
Potato Lodge.
Potato Lodge, which is
We can
now
see that from our,
part of Vagabond
Yeah.
Village now.
Well,
well, near there.
no, it's near there. I
It's-
think that all those houses or all those cabins have all been sold
They're all
off.
privately.
And they never amounted to much. I think
No.
some of them were torn down.
Yeah,
But Potato Lodge was what you'd say about 300 or 400 feet west of Vagabond Village.
How was the fishing then? Better than now?
I don't remember
I'm sure it was.
because I don't care much about fishing.
Well, I remember when we started going up there after George and Vera bought the house, and whenever they bought it in about 50,
55?
no, well, I don't know, 55, 56, I think. And I used to go fishing with George, and we used to come back and we'd actually catch fish.
Well, he'd catch fish off the end of the dock.
Well,
that's
yeah,
right,
but
he
I'm
did.
talking about when we'd go out and troll on the drop-offs. We used to come home with fish, and it got to the point where you could troll clear around the lake, and you'd come back and say, I had a strike. Yeah. Great day. That's when I stopped buying fishing licenses.
Well, okay, Robert, now knowing your personality and your willingness to express yourself, I think you've kind of held back here fairly well. So now we've learned a lot about Jeanette. Tell us some of your early remembrances.
Well, I suppose you want me to give you the history of my grandparents and great-grandparents and so forth. Well, first of all, I'll have to say that on my father's side, I knew not too much, because E.C., and that's my father to you who are watching, was never one to talk about his relatives. And in fact, if you would ask him to talk about the relatives, he really didn't care much talking about them. But there are some things that we do know, and some of this stuff has been dug up by Robley. But my great-grandfather came to Effingham, Illinois, the same town that Jeanette's great-grandparents were in. And in the I believe 60 or the 1870 census, he lived in Effingham, and he was a plasterer. He had a son whose name was Evan M. Hunt. Now, I never knew my grandfather to call himself Evan. He called himself Marshall E. Hunt. And Dad said he never knew what the E stood for, and he was always called he was Marshall. And we believe that this was common in those days, that kids would change their name around if they didn't like them. So we assume that Marshall E. Hunt was the Evan M. Hunt, because the dates are all right. And oh yes, we also knew that he had a sister. I've forgotten what his sister's name was. Robley knew. We knew that Marshall's mother's name was Virginia.
That's right.
And that his father had a biblical name. And we found in the library in Effingham, Illinois, the 1870 census, here was a sheet for this family, the Hunt family, and it was Hezekiah Hunt and Virginia Hunt. And there were, I think, 4 children. There was an Albert and an Evan M. Hunt and we thought it was Turlina, but that was... No, it was Turlina.
Oh.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, I guess you're right.
Turlina, Turlina. Now, I never heard my father ever speak of his Aunt Turlina. He did mention to me about Uncle Albert, and there's a story about Uncle Albert going to Alaska, which I'll relate later. But anyway, Marshall Hunt, my grandfather, was born in 1859, and his father was a plasterer in Effingham, Illinois. He met a woman by the name of Emma Jack. The last name was J-A-C-K, Jack. What the circumstances were of their meeting, I do not know. But they were married in about 1881. Dad, my father, E.C. Hunt, was born in Muscatine, Iowa in 1883. Dad had 1 brother and 1 sister. His brother was Earl, younger than Dad by about 8 years. And he had a sister, Letha, who was younger than he by about 2 or 3 years. Now on my mother's side, her grandfather was from Barry, Illinois, and we went back to, when I say we, Jeanette and I and Robley, went back to Barry, Illinois, and we went to the library to look at some of the old historic records. And the librarian gave me a copy of the minutes of the city council meetings. And I'm not sure what the dates were. But anyway, they were all signed by Alexander Burke. Now that was I gotta get this straight, my grandmother's father. No, I'm getting wrong here. I'm wrong here.
Burke was Dano's maiden name.
Okay, there was Alexander Burke. Now, Alexander Burke had a son, and by this time it had to be after 1876, because that was when Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. We were talking about Alexander Bell Burke. That was my mother's father. He worked in a grocery store in Barry, Illinois, and eventually took a job in a grocery store in Hannibal. And mother moved to Hannibal as a young girl along with her mother. And she had a brother by the name of Edmund, who was 2 years younger than mother. It was in Hannibal that my father and my mother met. Mother played the piano. She had been given music lessons when she was a young girl, and she played the piano in a Nickelodeon, which was a nickel theater that showed 20-minute comedies or 40-minute sagas. They were common in those days. She played the piano there to earn pin money and help the family. And my father and another fellow by the name of Harry Janes had both come from Belle Plaine, Iowa, and they worked for the telephone company in Hannibal. And as a moonlighting job, they bought this Nickelodeon, which amounted to buying the chairs and the projector and the screen. It was in a rented building, and in those days the theater was nothing more than a flat-floored building that you put a projector up on the wall, and it amounted to this thing that we'd call home movies today, with a projector in the back that you had to hand crank. Well, mother played the piano, and mother and dad met there, and they got married July 16th, 1909 in Joy, Illinois.
Who would they have shown in these movies?
Who would they have shown?
Yeah, who would have acted in
Who were the stars of the
Performers,
movies
yeah.
they were
Oh,
watching?
you want to remember,
Like Charlie Chaplin,
this
or-
was just the very beginning of the movies, and they probably hadn't even come to the star system then. I doubt that Charlie Chaplin was even in them in 1909. The first movie, you know, was called The Great Train Robbery, and movies in those days were comedies, or they were instructional things, or what do you call these things where you go, travelogues.
Yeah.
Things like travelogues and comedies. The movie industry at that time, after all, movies only got going in about 1900, and this was 1909, so there'd only been 9 years there. And so I'm not speaking with authority, but I don't believe the star system had ever
So there
been
weren't any big
implemented by
stars,
that time.
Backing up to Dano's childhood, or your mother, I called her Dano, was my grandmother. She knew Mark Twain or Becky Thatcher?
Well, okay, here's this, of course, everybody, I guess, knows that Mark Twain, or Samuel Clemens as his actual name, came from Hannibal. And the story Mark Twain was actually the story of Mark Twain's life when he was in Hannibal.
The story
Now-
of Tom Sawyer, or Huckleberry Finn.
Yes, well, the story of Tom Sawyer was, I forget what I said there, but Tom Sawyer, there was really a story of Mark Twain's young life in Hannibal. Now, Mark Twain had written the book and had become famous by the time that my mother was born. She was born in 1891. But there's an interesting story that Mother told me. You have to realize this was a different age. People did things differently in those days. There were some things that were the same. And when my mother was about 7 years old, 7 or 8, she was born in 1891, so this had to be 1898, 1899. Mark Twain had been asked, he lived back east in Massachusetts, I think, near Boston. He had been asked to come to Hannibal to be the speaker at the high school graduation. Well, they were doing the same things then that they do now, and he had accepted and had come back to Hannibal to be the speaker. Another thing that they did in those days was that they had elocution. Now, elocution was the ability to speak. And a lot of kids took elocution lessons. And Dano, or my mother, had taken elocution lessons, and she learned some little piece, I don't know what it was, but as part of the graduation ceremonies, one of the things that they did was the kids came on and did their bit. Well, Dano came on at age 7 or 8 and gave her elocution, or her speech, whatever it was. And as she was going off of the stage, she had a frilly white dress on. She walked in front of the people who were participating in the
Graduation?
Yeah, in the graduation. And she walked in front of Mark Twain, and he reached out and picked her up and set her on his lap. Well, she was only 7 years old, so she didn't really know who this fellow was, except that he was supposed to be important. And she said she sat there until it was time for Mark Twain to give his speech, and he put her down and she ran off the stage. So my mother could say she sat on Mark Twain's lap. Now that was the story as she told it to me. Well, anyway, Mother and Dad were married, and Dad took his first job as a local manager for a telephone company in Hampton, Iowa. He stayed there just 10 months. Dad was always looking for a better job. One of the things, he impressed this on me in many of the stories he told me, that he wanted to get his name on stationery, and he wanted to say he was a manager. He thought that was terribly important. And when he took this job, he had been working in Hannibal for the telephone company there. It's called the Bluff City Telephone Company. He was looking for another job and responding to ads in telephony, and he answered one for Hampton, Iowa. And about this time, he and Mother got married, and he quit his job all simultaneously. Quitting the job, getting married, and moving to Hampton were all accomplished in a matter of a week or so. And he moved to Hampton, took this job as manager, and Dad said that within the first week he had gone down to the local printer and gotten stationery printed that was the Hampton Telephone Company, E.C. Hunt Local Manager. Now he thought he could answer other ads in telephony with a little more clout by using his stationery that said E.C. Hunt Local Manager. Well, Mother and Dad stayed in Hampton only 10 months. It was strictly a stepping stone to still a better job, and Dad answered an ad in telephony for a general manager at Creighton, Nebraska. Well, that sounded better than a local manager, and he investigated the job, went over by train, that's the way they traveled in those days, took the job, and he worked there for about 2 years, and he had an opportunity to buy the company. I don't want to go into all the details. It's in the book that I have recently written. But anyway, from there in 1913, the family moved to Malmo. I wasn't born yet, because I wasn't born until 1919. Of course, I have no remembrances of Malmo. As a kid, I have remembrances of going back to Malmo when we owned the telephone exchange there as a young man. Then they moved to Walt Hill. Dad bought the exchange in Walt Hill, and they moved there in 1922. And I had a brother, Emery. He was 7 years, 9 or 7 years, 11 months older than I am, so
Was he born in Malmo?
no, he was born in Creighton. Mother and Dad lived in Creighton in 1911, and he was born in November of 1911. In 1922, we moved to Walt Hill, and in 1926, we moved to Blair. Dad had acquired the telephone company in Blair, which is a story all in itself.
Why don't you just quickly relate that? That's kind of interesting.
Well, that story about getting the telephone company? Well, Dad had always wanted to get an exchange close to Omaha, and he went to the Bell Company when he lived down in Malmo and tried to buy the Elkhorn Exchange. And they gave him the story that no, they didn't want to sell Elkhorn because it was in Douglas County and they owned Omaha and they wanted to have everything in Douglas County. And why didn't he go up here and buy the exchange at Blair? There were two telephone companies in Blair, the Bell Company and the Independent, and the Bell Company had tried to buy out the Independent, and they had tried to sell to them, and the Independent would do neither. Their attitude to the Bell Company was get out of town, and the Bell Company had too much pride to just get out of town, and of course the Independent Company were not very smart, because the Bell Company could have lost money in Blair for 1,000 years and never gone broke. But anyway, while Dad was in Malmo, he started buying stock in the Blair Telephone Company, and he didn't have much success. And besides, Blair was a long ways off, and he couldn't devote too much time to it. In the meantime, he had acquired the exchange at Walt Hill and Rosalie and Winnebago, and we moved there in 1922. And the first thing he did was go through a big remodeling job, put in a new cable plant and a new switchboard and built a new central office, and really everything was new. And in 1925 or 24, 25, somewhere around in there, he had enough time to return to this business of buying the stock in the Blair Telephone Company. And he came to Blair and he associated himself with a fellow by the name of Thomas T. Osterman, who ran Blair's leading newspaper, which was the Pilot Tribune. And Tom Osterman was a man that knew everybody and his dog, and he probably even knew the dog's name. And as I've said before, he didn't only know about everybody, he knew where all the bodies were buried. And he was in favor of this consolidation of the companies. Well, Dad came in here with money that he had borrowed from Harry Cheney in Creighton, and he started out contracting customers. And Tom Osterman did the same. Dad supplied money to Tom to buy this stock, and it was in sometime in the latter part of I'd say December 1925, it became obvious, to Dad at least, that he probably had control. And the local board of directors, they didn't know who had control because they had not transferred any stock on their books for years. And some of this stock had been transferred from person to person to person. They'd actually used the stock as money. In fact, there was one stock certificate that my dad had 17 transfer signatures on it, where they just said transferred to Pete Smith, Henry Brown, transferred to somebody else, Pete Smith, or whatever it was. And anyway, Dad finally called a special stockholders meeting in February of 1926, and he had control. And as I say, the board of directors, they didn't know who had control because they didn't even know at that time who owned stock. And it was a case of where the people who had originally built the company in 1902, they had lost interest. This was 23 years later. They had lost interest in running the telephone company. And the running of the telephone company had become set and hardened in a set of board of directors that perpetuated themselves. And And it took a third party to come in and shake up the whole thing. And Dad was that guy that came in and shook it up and got control. And within 30 days from the time he had control, he had put in the necessary cables and equipment to tie the two Bell and the independent offices together. And for the first time in the history of Blair, they had one telephone system. And that was within 30 days from the time he bought it.
So he was able to get Bell to sell out.
Oh, he had before he ever started. You see, the Bell Company had suggested when he lived in Malmo, they had suggested that he come to try and buy the Blair Telephone Company. They had tried and had been unsuccessful. And of course, before EC started on this, he had a signed agreement with the Bell Company that if he was successful in obtaining control, they would sell to him for a fixed price. That was a guaranteed price. And of course, as soon as he had control, he went to the Bell Company and they readily sold out to him, and there was no problem there with the Bell Company at all. And we finally got one telephone company. And then after that, of course, Dad embarked on a program of putting in a new cable plant, building a new office, and well, it was a complete new system. Well, that gets us up to 1926. I started in the kindergarten and first grade in Walt Hill. I don't have too much remembrances about it. The one thing I remember in kindergarten was making marbles out of clay and letting them harden all night and then shellacking them the next day. That's about my entire memory of kindergarten. And first grade, I remember the teacher's name, Alberta May Bitney, for whatever that's worth. And I started in the second grade in Blair, graduated from high school there, met Jeanette when we had our first date on our 16th birthday, October 31st, 1935. We know exactly.
Tell the story of meeting her. What your friend said, don't you want to meet this girl from Canada?
Oh, yes. Well, okay. Jeanette had moved over here in, well, when I'm thinking about it now, it had to be about 34. The summer of 30.
I started my sophomore year. We moved over the summer of my sophomore year.
Okay, and during that summer, Jeanette was down at the swimming pool, and I had a girlfriend. She was when I say a girlfriend, she was a classmate. Her name was Dorothy Dietz, and she came up to me and says, "Say, do you want to meet this new girl from Kennard?" And I said, "Kennard? I don't want to meet anybody from Kennard." After all, nobody that came from a town of 250, and here I was, a big guy in a town of 3,000 population. Well, of course you know the story that I eventually married the girl that I turned down the chance to meet. Well, we started going together in high school, and of course, you know, it eventually ended up that we got married, and I guess I don't need to go any further than that. That's my first. That gets my history up to when I'm 16 years old.
One thing I did want to mention about my great-grandpa Jake McCracken, cutest little Scotchman you ever did see, one thing. He was in the Civil War. He lied about his age to get in. But one of the highlights of the war was the fact that he shook hands with Abraham Lincoln. And I couldn't believe it. But apparently President Lincoln had come to visit the troops someplace around wherever and shook hands with him. And Grandpa was right there on the front line and shook hands with him. I thought that was pretty interesting.
Well, we've had two famous then. We've had Abraham Lincoln and Mark Twain that have touched these people.
Yeah, the Hunt family.
Well, that's good. Do you know why he wanted to get in the war so badly, or?
I do not know. He was just, really, he was just a kid.
How old do you think he was?
15, I think he was.
I think he said he was 15. And, oh, he was quite a guy. I always liked him, and Grandma was she switched around in her long skirts into the day she died.
Excuse me,
She had red
people.
hair. She had red hair. She put henna rinse on it. She was a bug.
So she was going to have red hair.
She was going to and did have red hair. She was an Armstrong, and her heritage was from England. So, I think that's about all I had to. Well, I can't remember exactly where we left off, but I started high school in the 10th grade in Blair. That's after we had moved over, of course. And I had a nice high school, 3 years there. I was active in the band, the orchestra, and glee club. I was in the, I know I wasn't looking.
Well,
Operetta.
you were in the operettas.
And, get me off my train of thought.
What
Class plays.
And,
what instrument did you play?
well, I played baritone sax, very, very ladylike instrument. And then in the orchestra, I played the cello. And I remember Betty Beattie, who was my matron of honor. We'd go play various places. Here was Betty, the piccolo, slung under her
No
arm.
flute.
She played the piccolo.
Okay, all
Your
right.
daughter played the flute.
Okay.
But anyhow, we didn't have transportation for all of our instruments in those days. We had to get our own instruments wherever we were going. And here was Betty with her piccolo under her arm. Here was Jeanette lugging that great big cello. Anyhow, then of course we had our graduation day, and it was very, very much fun. And I did the last of every day, instead of going to study in study hall, they would let me go up to the bank, and I worked in the bank after school every day on Saturdays.
So you started co-op training very early.
Very early, yes. And that was fun. I used to take machine dictation from my dad, because I didn't know shorthand. Boy, I pretty good typist in those days.
Typed a lot of my term papers.
All
of
them.
Well,
Anyhow,
you and Bob were in plays together, weren't you?
yes, we were in the
Senior
senior
class
class play. We had the lead. And
She had the female lead and I had the male lead.
well, obviously.
That's a good way to do it.
Huh?
I say obviously.
Yeah, well,
What was the play? What was the name of the play?
Fire,
it
new
was,
fire.
it's called New
New
Fires.
fires.
New Fires.
Mhm.
Yeah. It was a flashback thing where it wasn't. It started out and
We
then
started out,
at the current time, and then
Uh-huh.
flashed back when we were young kids, and then we.
but I don't remember how we did it, but they braid our hair when it first opened.
Then
Then-
they,
I don't know how we
then
had to
between acts
brush
we
it
went
out.
back, and then we were young, and then we came
Oh.
back. It was a pretty good production, really.
The operetta, K.O. Vinton and I had the lead in that, and that was fun.
What was that?
Garden of the Moon.
Yeah, Garden of the
Garden
Moon.
of the Moon. Now, where did I pull that out?
That's what it was.
Then, of course, come the fall of 1937, we both went down to Lincoln to school. He pledged Delta Upsilon, and I pledged Alpha Phi. And that was a lot of fun. I can't remember too much. I did not graduate from college because Daddy was ambassador to the
Sorry.
Sarvin at the time, and they wanted him to let me be a countess in 1939. So I just said, okay.
Well,
Knew
it was
we were
such
going
an
to-
expensive thing to be a countess that George said he couldn't have her be a countess and go to school too. Huh?
He didn't say that.
Well,
It was
he
my
didn't say
idea that
but
I didn't want to.
She didn't want to put additional burden on the family.
Well, anyhow, that was not it. But let's skip that part. We're taking up
What
a good
was
time.
that?
And I enjoyed being a countess, met a lot of friends, met a lot of people, and were good friends after that. Well, I went back to the bank to work while he finished college because I thought, we're going to get married. And I'll just save up my money to buy my sterling and buy this and put it in the hope chest, which I did. So
Well, all
that's
right.
why I'm not a college graduate.
And then, of course, I went on to school and I pledged Delta Youth Salon, which is what Mick pledged, by the way. And I graduated in May of 1942. I had a ROTC commission, and of course Uncle Sam, the war had started on December 7th, 1941, so Uncle Sam obviously had a job for me.
What did you study in college?
Beg pardon?
What did you study in college?
Well, I went through business administration school. I had 1 year of law school, which I didn't like, and I took 1 year of law school because EC was paying the bill, and EC wanted me to take law, and I didn't like law, but I withstood 1 year of it. Anyway, I had a commission, so right after graduation, I was called in. Jeanette and I got married on June 1st. The graduation was, I think, around the 23rd of May, and we got married June 1st. And I was called into the Army for a refresher course out at Camp Roberts, California. I'll never forget leaving there in our car. We had so much time to get there. There was a speed limit in those days of 50 miles an hour, which was not to save gasoline. The United States was awash in gasoline. The speed limit was to conserve tires because the Japanese had invaded all of the areas over in Sumatra and Malaya and all that place where they raise rubber trees. And so we had a shortage of rubber. Well, anyway, they had this 50-mile-an-hour speed limit, and we got to California in about, how many hours was it? 52 hours? 52 hours. And it was a case of where we never drove over 50 miles an hour, but we'd each drive for about 4 or 5 hours, and then one would get in the back seat and the other drive, and we just kept going. Well, anyway, we spent some time in Camp Roberts. Then I was assigned back to Fort Sill, where I went through the communications and an electronics course. I was then assigned to the 100th Infantry Division, and after being there about a year, I went overseas and was assigned as a post utilities officer in a camp right outside of Birmingham, England. Anyway, I was there for 18 months, and I came back in June of 1945.
You had a family by then.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes.
I have a question about the war for both of you. Where were you at the time the war broke out and you realized what was going to happen and that your lives were going to change? Where were you and what did you think?
You mean on December 7th?
Yeah.
When they
invaded Pearl Harbor.
When they invaded Pearl Harbor? Well, I can tell you exactly where I was. I heard it on the radio. It was a Sunday. And I was sitting in my room in the fraternity house. We had the radio on. Ed May and I were roommates. I don't know whether Ed was in the room or not. That I can't remember. But I remember I was studying Sunday morning, and along came the news that the Japanese had invaded Pearl Harbor. Now you say, what were my thoughts at the time? Boy, that's a long time ago. I don't know exactly what my thoughts were, except it was obvious that we were going to get in the war, and I was very glad that I was taking advanced military science and tactics because I'd have a commission, and I wouldn't have to be taken in the Army by the draft. Because when you went in by the draft, you were, well, you didn't have the advantages of a commissioned officer.
Yeah.
Now that's what my thoughts were. I don't know where Jeanette was at the time.
We were in the living room of the house at 202 East South Street. Well, I don't know what it is now, 14 something. Talk louder. I was there with Mother and Daddy, and for a minute I just felt like the rug had been pulled out from under me, because we had already decided we were going to be married soon, that is within months, and I thought, oh boy, I wonder if he'll have to go to war and I'll never see him again. That was the thought that went through my mind.
Now tell about how you missed out on the D-Day invasion. That's interesting.
Oh, well, okay, that's kind in charge of all the utilities on the post except one. I didn't have charge of the telephone system. That was under the Signal Corps. Now this is typically Army. Well, you thought the story was interesting, and I spent 18 months doing that, and then came back to the United States, and when I came back, boy, oh boy, the war in Europe was over. The war against the Japanese was still going on, and man alive, say, better shut it off. There's a roadrunner out there, Mama. Go out, go out and feed your roadrunner. We can let this go.
Oh, what's the road?
Oh, you want me to keep going with it?
Yeah, why not?
Well, all right. Well, anyway.
What happened to the other? There was over 100 men, I would assume, that out of your division that went ahead and were in on the. Do you know what happened to any of them?
No,
How many were
we
lost?
do not know. All I know is in the 100th Infantry Division, or no, not the 100th, the 1st Division, that they suffered something like 40 or 50% casualties. Now, a casualty is either a death or an injury.
Yeah.
And so I always considered myself very lucky that I never had to actually shoot a gun or a cannon or a field gun at the enemy. The only thing I really had to do was dodge a few buzz bombs and V-2 rockets in London. My job was such that I had to make trips to London on occasions, and the Germans were sending these V-2s rockets over, which had been preceded by the pilotless aircraft. And none of this was very successful. It only made the British more determined and madder than ever that they were going to defeat Hitler. And of course, you all know what happened there. Well, that's that story, Mick. I suppose you can shut it off.
Bob brought baby Gail and I home to Blair to live with my folks, and we had a nice time. You got to know your grandparents, and Bob was very faithful to write, and he's kind of taking that up again. But anyhow, Bob had given me on my 16th birthday a darling little blonde Cocker Spaniel. And of course I came home with another dog called Weenie. Well, Blondie just took over. She just loved that dog. And she also thought Gail was pretty nice. She followed her around in her tailor tot. One day, I don't know just how old you were at the time, but you were in the tailor tot scooting around. And I heard Gail just screaming her lungs out. Didn't hear the dog or anything, so I tore out to the kitchen. We always tried to keep that door shut into the basement. Well, somehow it didn't get shut very good. And here was Gail screaming her head off. She wanted to get down those stairs, and Blondie just had all 4 feet planted right there, and she would not budge. You don't remember that,
Oh, no, I was
no.
probably less than a year old.
No. Well, another funny little thing that happened, my grandpa, the Kraken, thought Gail was just pretty nice, and he also kind of liked dogs. and he looked at Weenie, and it was cold weather. He had his gloves, and he went like this, you know, just playing. And Blondie took exception to it.
What's going on out there? Shut that thing off.
Oh, they're
About Grandpa and flapping his mittens at
The dog.
Weenie. Well, Blondie took exception to that. And she barked and growled at Grandpa, and she'd never done that before. She was protecting little Weenie.
Then there was another occasion of where Blondie protected Gail. Gail was not in her tailor tots. She was on the floor, and again the door to the basement in the kitchen had been left open, and Gail was trying to get down there, and the dog had gotten a hold of Gail's hair. Now, she had great long hair. Jeanette had never cut her hair. It was quite long. And the dog understood that by grabbing her hair, he wasn't going to hurt her, and he grabbed her hair and pulled her over. He jumped up and grabbed her hair and pulled her over, and she's lying on the floor, and he is dragging her away from the door that went into the basement.
I really like the basement.
You certainly must
Well,
have.
what we're really talking about is the fact that the dog was smart enough to know
Yes.
that going falling down those steps was dangerous.
But by the time I got out to the kitchen, I said to Gil, "What's the matter? Blondie's pulling my hair." Oh dear. Well, anyhow, do you want to call this off and let us finish at another time?
Well, let's go another.
Well, I don't know just where we should go now, except I came back from the Army, and or came back from Europe. In the Army, of course, we were still fighting Japan, but I was back in Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. The atomic bomb was dropped. I was the only one in the organization that knew anything about atomic energy, and I happened to be talking to a major who was, he was the battalion adjutant, and he asked me some questions, and I told him something about atomic energy and how this could happen. And the first thing I knew, I was assigned as a lecturer. And I gave lectures for about 4 or 5 days, 4 lectures a day, talking to thousands of men about what the atomic bomb was and how it could work. Now, I don't mean to hold myself up as an atomic physicist, but I was the only one around there that had any knowledge of what the import of this thing was, and I shouldn't have been shooting my mouth off to this major because all of a sudden I had a new job. Well, that was only a temporary thing. Eventually we got to Camp Stoneman, California. We were going to get on a boat to go over and fight the Japanese, and we landed there September 2nd, and September 2nd was the day they signed the surrender on board the battleship Missouri, and everything was called off. And we sat in Camp Stoneman for 23 days and did nothing. In my particular battery, there was 4 officers. And here we were with, well, the only thing we had to do was be sure to get up by 9 o'clock to get over to the mess hall, or we couldn't have breakfast, because that's when they closed. And it was a waste of time, a complete waste of time. I was there for 23 days. They didn't want me. They sent me to Fort Sill. Fort Sill didn't want me. They sent me to Camp Funston, temporary duty. They didn't want me. And finally, the Army decided that they were going to discharge these officers. Up to this time, they had discharged enlisted men, but they hadn't discharged officers. And here were hundreds of officers around with no men, no duties, no nothing. And finally, on January 1st, no, doesn't really make a difference. December 31st, I was sent to Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, which was a separation center, and I got out of the Army and came home. Well, that's it, Mick. Push the button. It's tape 4, and we're ending it, and Rush, you can put these altogether.